All righty, we're going to go ahead and get started. We've allowed a minute or two for everybody to join us. Thank you all for being here today to observe this webinar on the concept of standards for evaluations in USPAP. If you were hoping to see the new Apple iPhone 11 debut, you're in the wrong webinar. But hopefully we'll have some exciting stuff for you here today. I am joined by the chair of the Appraisal Standards Board, Wayne Miller. I am John Brenan. I'm the Vice President of Appraisal Issues with the Foundation. Wayne, welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, John. As always, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Great, great. Glad to have you. We're going to go ahead and get started, and we're going to start with some logistics here. And we'll let you know that the webinar is being recorded for viewing on the Foundation's YouTube channel later if you or your colleagues would like to view it then. We also have a brief survey at the conclusion of the webinar. We would greatly appreciate your taking just a minute or two to fill that out. We want to make these webinars as informative and effective as possible. So that if you just take a minute and let us know what we can do better, what you liked, what you didn't like, that would be great. At the end of our presentation today, we're anticipating to have some time to answer some questions. We will be, the way that you ask a question is by using the chat feature on the Zoom presentation that you're watching. You can go down to the bottom of your screen, and a menu, if you send your cursor down, a menu will appear, and you can go to the chat function. Alternatively, you can simply use the keyboard shortcut Alt-H, and that will bring up the chat menu. And in that menu, you will be able to ask your questions, and again, time permitting, we will answer as many of them as possible at the end of the session today. Also in the chat feature, and so you'll want to make sure you do this, is you will see a link to the exposure draft page on our website where you will be able to download the concept paper that the ASB issued which is the basis for what we're talking about today, the evaluation standards in USPAP, and the link is now been shared in our chat box. You should be able to see it if you're on the chat function. You'll also get a PDF of today's PowerPoint presentation there if you'd like to go back and refer to that. And that's what we show here on the screen. So the link to the presentation is now live there as well. So that's enough of the housekeeping. Let's get down to business and try to provide some information for you and hopefully be able to answer some questions at the end. What we're talking about today, as I led off with, is the concept of creating standards for evaluations in USPAP. Mr. Miller, would you like to talk a little bit about what this is all about?
Well, certainly, John. First off, let's understand that this is a narrowly focused issue. Right? Evaluations are real property valuation assignments, and they are a construct of Title 11 of FIREA. Secondly, to explain a little bit more, evaluations are completed for federally regulated financial institutions when an appraisal may not be required to support a real estate secured transaction or credit decision. And this could be a new loan origination, renewal, a loan monitoring event, etc. There are instances when the transaction may be eligible for an evaluation, however, an appraisal is ordered instead. And I think it's fundamental to understand that this is a risk-based decision for the financial institution. Also, just to clear up a misconception that I've heard out in the marketplace is the definition of market value that is used in appraisals is the same definition that is used in evaluations. So the result of an evaluation is the market value of the real property. And, we've listed the definition or the salient items in the definition here on the PowerPoint. But the key point here is market value is the same, whether it's included in an appraisal or in an evaluation.
And Wayne, I think that's a great point to underscore here for our participants, and that is that there's a lot of people that may call certain things evaluations or other nomenclature, but when we talk about evaluations, we're talking about that particular creation by the federal financial banking agencies, not some other entities or some other types of assignments. So I think that's a good point to really highlight there.
Great.
All right, let's talk about why the ASB is considering this topic, and I'm going to underscore considering and allow you to explain that a little bit.
Yeah, considering is the word to emphasize here, John. To be clear, the ASB has made no decisions regarding this issue other than the decision to release this concept paper in order to receive stakeholder input on this matter. So we're not, actively writing standards. We are trying to seek the input of appraisers and users of appraisal services and regulators on this topic.
Great. So why is this process necessary?
Well, first off, there are no development or reporting standards for evaluations. There are guidelines that are included in the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines, but these are instructions to banks and to other financial institutions regarding the administration of their real estate collateral valuation programs. This is as opposed to clear development or reporting standard requirements for those who are completing evaluations. In addition, there are some market forces that have brought about increasing de minimis threshold levels, particularly for new loan originations, which may result in a significant number of higher dollar, more complex properties being valued in evaluations rather than appraisals.
And we'll talk more about this in a minute, but there still seems to be quite a bit of confusion and conflicting information for appraisers out there, right?
Yeah, it's, there seems to be confusion and conflict out there, certainly on the part of some state regulatory agencies and financial institutions as to what an evaluation is and whether an appraiser can complete one. And this actually may keep appraisers from completing evaluations. John, I find it the cruelest of ironies that an appraiser who is a trained valuation expert might somehow be precluded from rendering a work product where the result is market value. Now, this could be either because the appraiser is fearful that they cannot complete the evaluation in accordance with USPAP or state law, or because the client only wants a limited presentation and thus is hesitant to hire an appraiser because they don't want all that might be required in an appraisal.
And all this kind of leads into public trust in the profession, right?
Absolutely. USPAP is all about maintaining public trust in the valuation profession. So in a market where the commercial or non-residential de minimis level has doubled, or in the case of one agency, quadrupled from what it was, and the residential de minimis level has increased by 60%, the question has been posed to the ASB as to whether evaluation standards should be developed.
Right. And we alluded to this a moment ago, and it seems that we have some participants that are in full agreement about this controversy and confusion regarding this entire process for appraisers. So I guess the first question is, Wayne, can licensed and certified appraisers perform evaluations?
Well, yeah, typically the answer is yes, John. There's other resources section of this presentation later on. We'll actually refer to a webinar that you and I presented in October of 2017, where we discussed the nuts and bolts of completing an evaluation in conformance with USPAP. However, that being said, sometimes conflicts in nomenclature or required labeling may occur. As an example, when an appraiser is reporting the results of an evaluation under Standard 2 of USPAP, the appraiser is required by USPAP to label it either as an appraisal report or a restricted appraisal report. Of course, as noted in USPAP, the appraiser can also use another label like evaluation to distinguish it perhaps from other work product. However, the ASB has learned that in some states, in addition to the required USPAP report label, an evaluation is required to have language which reads, "This is not an appraisal." So you can see the confusion on the part of appraisers who are, on the one hand, required perhaps by their state to perform in accordance with USPAP, and yet they have to say that their work product is not an appraisal.
You know, and to that point, Wayne, just I thought I'd throw in real quick here. Many of us who have been in the appraisal business for a long time remember an old drive-by form that said, that was a 704, I believe was the form, and it asked for the appraiser to say, my opinion of value is X, and right below it a statement saying this is not an appraisal, and hence the confusion. And it sounds like this is we're talking about the same thing here.
Absolutely. You know, John, also the ASB has heard from various parties that, you know, the real property appraisal development and reporting standards, that's, you know, standards 1 and 2, may be too burdensome for some evaluation assignments. So referring back to our, you know, 2017 webinar, while, you know, in general, the ASB believes that it is certainly possible to complete an evaluation as a restricted appraisal report by meeting the minimum content requirements of both USPAP and the items that are noted in the interagency guidelines for evaluations. But some institutions, financial institutions, and individuals completing evaluations have indicated otherwise. The ASB is particularly interested in hearing from stakeholders on this topic in response to the concept paper. So what elements of standards 1 and 2 are difficult to navigate in the context of an evaluation?
And I think another point here is in that October 2017 webinar that we talked about, we even compared the interagency guidelines to those in an appraisal report, not even a restricted appraisal report. And again, the difference was not that significant.
That's true. You know, John, the minimum requirements under restricted appraisal report are actually less than the suggested guideline content of an evaluation in many cases.
Great. So a $64,000 question is an evaluation an appraisal or not?
Well, our comment here, John, is yes and no. And it depends upon where you are, whether you're credentialed, and who you ask.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about appraisals versus evaluations. And as you kind of alluded to there, a lot of it is definitional, right?
Sure. Yeah, the you know, definitions of appraisal vary. So under USPAP, there's a broad definition that a market value that would indicate that a market value rendered in an evaluation is an appraisal. So it is a market value opinion. Consequently, it is an appraisal. You know, state laws do vary. In some states, they have straight up adopted the USPAP definition, and so an appraisal or an evaluation, since it is a a market value opinion or a value opinion would be considered an appraisal. Other states have variations of this definition that that are similar to. They may have additional language associated with them. Other states have carve-outs in their appraiser licensing laws when appraisers are completing evaluations. And still others call anything with a value an appraisal, and therefore only licensed or certified appraisers can complete evaluations in those states. Lastly, the interagency appraisal and evaluation guideline definition of appraisal, as noted here, includes language which encompasses elements of both the USPAP definitions of appraisal and appraiser, including independence, impartiality, an adequate description of the property, and a supported value indication. And since we're comparing and contrasting here, it's important to note that the interagency guideline definition of evaluation is a valuation of real property that is permitted when an appraisal is not required or may not be required due to the transaction threshold exemptions.
Great, Wayne. And I think just the information on this one slide alone helps underscore the point of why there is confusion and a lack of clarity with differing definitions and sources that appraisers are expected to be aware of. When it comes to enforcing standards for appraisals, and again, we're talking about standards here because that's what the Standards Board does. Whether they do ultimately develop standards for evaluations is one thing, but let's talk about who enforces these standards for appraisals.
Sure. Well, first off, let's talk about the ASB. The ASB promulgates, which means it's a fancy way of saying creates and edits and maintains USPAP. But the ASB and the Appraisal Foundation do not enforce the standards. If we move on to the interagency guidelines, so FIREA and the interagency guidelines specify that real property appraisals for federally related transactions must be performed by state licensed or certified appraisers. And therefore, state regulatory agencies are responsible for enforcement of standards and the overall performance of real property appraisers. And what I'll say here, John, is the next logical slide in this presentation could be who enforces evaluation standards. However, as noted previously, there are no national evaluation standards that those completing evaluations are required to adhere to. So we don't have that slide.
So essentially, when we talk about enforcement there, it's really enforcement by the bank examiners as to whether or not the financial institutions are following them, not quote unquote enforcement of what the appraiser on the appraiser itself.
That's correct.
Right. So Wayne, what is the ASB doing to try to bring some clarity and help in this issue?
Well, beyond this concept paper, we're trying to gather some ideas about, whether evaluation standards should be included in USPAP. First off, we've mentioned a few times now the 2017 webinar, Performing Evaluations in Compliance with USPAP. That is available on the Appraisal Foundation website for folks to take a look at. Advisory Opinion 13 was developed a number of years ago to give appraisers guidance on performing evaluations of real property collateral to conform with USPAP. And then lastly, because of the buzz around this topic, the board has been working on sample USPAP compliant evaluations for both residential and non-residential properties. And we plan to publish those in the weeks ahead. This is sort of a companion, if you will, to the sample restricted appraisal report formats that are on the foundation website. And so, what we're doing is putting into action the items that we discussed in the 2017 webinar, and actually letting folks see it in black and white. This is how you can do it. Now, that may not be the exact format that every possible client may be interested in seeing. If they've got a fixed format, you can see what they're asking for that is not minimally required, if you will. But it's certainly a starting point for an appraiser in particular who is looking at the possibility of completing an evaluation for a bank or other financial institution client.
And Wayne, I'm looking forward to getting these out to the public. I think it'll be a very useful tool for appraisers to look at these sample evaluations that are in compliance with USPAP and maybe compare them to the sample restricted appraisal reports that already exist that you referenced, and see what the differences are there. And it's something that appraisers can use as part of their part of the options in their tool bag to try to figure out how and where they can perform these assignments.
Absolutely.
So I think the main message that you alluded to earlier is this is not necessarily a plan that the ASB has cemented going forward. This is something we're trying to hear from all of the affected constituents. So we're really looking to hear from people on this, right?
That's right, John. You and I have done 4 or 5 webinars, I think, over the last, 12 months or so. And most of those webinars have been to explain exposure drafts, or in the case, post-adoption of USPAP, explain, the decisions that have already been made by the ASB, or their current line of thinking on, potential adoptable changes. So this is a bit unique in that we don't have all the answers to share right now. What we have are the questions. We're trying to outline this issue. We ask folks to read, the 6-page concept paper and take a look at what we've outlined in terms of the background issues, what we've heard, see how that meshes with folks' experience regarding evaluations, and then please do write to us. As we've noted a few times here, we are considering the issue. We are genuinely interested in hearing what appraisers and clients and regulators and even members of the public have to say about this topic. John has here on our PowerPoint the dates and the methods to send your comments. So we'd like to get your comments in by October 11th. That gives folks plenty of time to think about it, a month. In addition, we are planning a hearing as a part of our public meeting. It will, for the most part, be our public meeting in October in Washington, D.C. And we're putting together panelists from state regulatory agencies, some of whom have either already addressed this issue in their state law or are considering it. Financial institutions, clearly, this evaluations, as we note, is a construct of FIREA, and consequently, it is a part of the risk-based analysis that financial institutions do when they're either adding to or monitoring their commercial and residential loan portfolios. And then also professional appraiser organizations, we're inviting representatives from those organizations to represent appraisers and, come and speak to us about the appraisers' viewpoint collectively on this topic. So, we urge everyone to either come and join us in Washington, D.C., or you can register and watch the meeting, the hearing, via our live stream process. As we get closer to that meeting, certainly for folks who have signed up here, we will push notifications to you of that upcoming meeting, ask you to register for the live stream, and then you'll get nifty reminders from Aida, who is our staff person, to go ahead and log in and watch the hearing.
Great, Wayne, thank you. And to that point, for those of you who do have the chat function enabled, Aida has placed a link in the chat box to register for the live stream of the hearing that Wayne just mentioned. So you can quickly and easily click on the link and sign up for the live stream.
This is why we love Aida. She's always ahead of the game there.
Precisely, precisely. Okay, we're going to take some time here to try to answer some of the questions. We've got several in here, and we will answer the ones that we can to the best of our ability. If there are questions that we're unable to answer or time does not permit, we will try to follow up at a later date with those. But the first question, and this is, we did address this, Wayne, but I believe it is worth again reiterating and underscoring. And the question is, has the ASB already decided to proceed with the development of standards for evaluations?
Well, emphatically, the answer is no. As we've tried to indicate, that we are considering this. It's a topic that has come to the board among other topics, but it's one that has gotten a lot of discussion of late out in the marketplace, and we're on a fact-finding and an opinion-finding mission.
Great.
And we'll see, depending upon the results of the hearing, the results of the responses to the concept paper, after our October meeting, we'll decide on next steps.
And Wayne, you mentioned this earlier on one of our slides, and I think it's probably somewhat related to what these questions are, and that is that the ASB is not necessarily taking a position that evaluations are a good thing or a bad thing or anything else. It's an issue that this is an area that the market seems to be going more and more to. And because of that, people have come to the standards board and said, how do we do, if we want to do these assignments, what can we do? What can't we do? And so I think that's also important, because there are some people that believe, because the ASB is even considering this issue, that there's somehow an implied blessing that evaluations are a good thing, or maybe not a good thing. But we still believe that the gold standard is a USPAP compliant appraisal, but sometimes you need more than one tool in the tool bag, right?
Right, that's correct. And I think one of the items that perhaps has motivated the board to put this concept paper out is the idea that appraisers are somehow limited by USPAP to, from providing evaluation services. Specifically within the interagency guidelines, it indicates that folks who can supply evaluations to financial institutions include appraisers. Well, if USPAP is hindering appraisers from being able to do so, again, particularly in a rising de minimis environment, then the board needs to take a look at USPAP and its flexibility. We've been, over the last several years, and my predecessors as well. I say over the last few years because I've been on the board for several years now, but my predecessors as well have looked at how USPAP can be more flexible and yet continue to protect and preserve the public trust.
Indeed. The another question that we've got is, if, and I'll underscore if here, as you've mentioned, if the ASB develops standards for evaluations, will they be contained in the 2020-21 edition of USPAP?
No, John, they will not. The it's a 2-year process really to put together changes to USPAP. And we are at the end of that cycle. In fact, USPAP, I believe, has gone to the publisher for the 2020-21 edition. Coursework has been written in the case of the 7 and 15-hour courses. The instructor recertification course has been written. Course providers who are also clamoring to put together their USPAP courses have received all of the requisite materials and content outlines and so forth, and they are working on their courses. So no, we're not going to rush something through and suddenly have it magically appear on January 1st as a part of the 2020-21 edition of USPAP.
Yeah, and just to underscore that, the 2021 USPAP, that cake is baked, and it is simply in the process of getting the books printed, getting the electronic version, and as you said, all the coursework being updated. Everything will be available by October 1, and as always, we encourage appraisers to take their update course, hopefully in that last quarter, sometime between October 1 and January 1, so that you'll completely understand the changes that were made to USPAP as you begin your practice on January 1st of 2020. Wayne, in addition to this concept of standards for evaluations in USPAP, is the board considering any other topics as part of its work?
Well, as we just noted, the cake just got baked on 2020-21 USPAP, and so we are at the point of setting an agenda for our next few years, if you will. Because we have put this concept paper out and we are planning the hearing in Washington, D.C., we're gonna hold off on sending out what we'll call a white paper survey to stakeholders, and we'll do that sometime in November or early December, asking the marketplace, what they think the relevant topics for ASB to address are for upcoming versions of USPAP. Lots of things going on out there, continued discussions of bifurcated appraisal assignments, continued discussions of automated valuation models and artificial intelligence, continued discussions on what's happening in the secondary market organizations and their efforts, and how those align with or collide with perhaps the requirements or guidance in USPAP.
And I think also, so two things. I mean, first of all, as you just stated, this is not the sole topic that the ASB is looking at for the next edition of USPAP, the 2022-23 edition. But a lot of this examination may lead to what the ASB has said they will continue examining, and that is the possibility of a single set of minimum reporting requirements. Can you see a way where some of these issues that are being talked about with what the requirements for evaluations are could actually tie into something like that?
I'd like to give you a one-word answer, John, but I can't. The topic of a single set of reporting standards is certainly still on the table. We, as I think folks know from our prior webinars, we did sort of pull it from consideration in the 11th hour, primarily because of some potential unintended consequences of going that direction. But it is still an item that is on the table. There are other, we started this webinar talking about the very narrow focus of this issue, right? So we're talking about a real property issue not only are we talking about a real property issue, but we're talking about real property valuation work that is being done for financial institutions, either as appraisals or evaluations. So there's a whole big world out there of other real property work, maybe work done for litigation, done for private individuals, done for financial reporting. In addition, there are personal property valuation issues that are out there, business valuation issues, review, and of course, assessment or mass valuation ad valorem issues that are out there as well. And when we are, as a board, looking at whether it's a topic on a single set of reporting requirements or other topics, we have to consider the impact on all of those other aspects of the valuation profession. So that's a tough nut to crack, as we noted during our last set of exposure drafts, but it isn't one that we have shelved indefinitely.
Great. Going to some more of the questions here. One of the questions asks about what if the federal agencies, and I assume that means the banking agencies, have come to the ASB to ask about evaluation. It says guidelines, but it's really, we're talking about standards to be promulgated. And I would just say there that I'm not aware of any particular requests by the federal banking agencies. I think they are interested in what the ASB is doing in considering this, and I think we look forward to their feedback, not only possibly from the concept paper, but at the public hearing as well, as you mentioned. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add there, Wayne.
I would agree. We have not received a formal letter prior to sending out this concept paper from the appraisal subcommittee or the FIFIEC agencies or anyone saying, please go explore evaluations for standards. So it's all on us. Great. We're not going to blame them for this.
Right. Another question, and this is kind of the gist of the whole thing, and it's laid out a bit in the concept paper. But it says if there's no development or reporting standards when a market value with a market value definition, I guess that's an opinion value, is applicable, it seems fundamentally in conflict with the current definition of appraisal in USPAP. So again, we touched on this, that there's this conflict where an opinion of value under USPAP is an appraisal, but an evaluation that renders an opinion of value would today be an appraisal. Would it have to be, there would be some definitional issues and others that would have to clarify what makes it a non-appraisal or evaluation, if you will.
Yes. This is a topic that informally or even formally in some of our, initial responses that has come to the board. If the board were to pursue some evaluation standards, there would be many aspects of the definitions, the rules, and the standards rules and the guidance and even Q&As or FAQs that would need to be looked at in order to be clear about when one is completing an evaluation in compliance with USPAP and when one is completing an appraisal or in compliance with USPAP. So, if the board determines that we're going to move in that direction, yes, there would be significant layers of changes that might be necessary.
Great. We have another question asking which states have actually passed laws regarding evaluations. I will say that we don't have a ready list at hand. There's a group of them. It's somewhere less than a dozen. I know that, for example, Tennessee, Alabama, and others have actually already passed statute. There are other states that are considering it, Texas, Florida, things like that. But Wayne, are there any that come to mind that you'd like to mention?
You've hit the ones that I'm most familiar with, John, so I don't have anything to add.
Okay. The thing that I would advise is if you are a practicing appraiser to contact your state and to see if they either have or are considering any type of legislation related to the practice of evaluations. The next question, I'm scrolling here, so give me a quick second. And this one we did address, but we can answer it right out quickly. Do evaluations apply to business appraisals?
In this context, no. Evaluations here, again, are very narrowly focused. They're, as I note, a construct of FIREA and the interagency guidelines. They're for real property only at this point. Now, there may be business appraisals, or for that matter, personal property appraisals that use that term somewhat loosely. You know, there's language actually within USPAP that basically says if it's an appraisal, it's an appraisal no matter what you call it. And so you can call it an evaluation, an opinion, a study, a something else. I don't have USPAP open in front of me. I guess I should. You know, regardless of what you call it, if it's a duck, it's a duck because it quacks and all that. So again, going back to the prior answer, it will be, in the event that the board does move forward, it will be a fine line to walk to detangle evaluation from appraisal, shall we say.
Great. There are a couple of questions kind of asking like what might the standards look like for evaluations for both development and reporting. And I think I'll comment here that quite frankly, the board doesn't know yet. And the board, like we've said repeatedly here, the board has not decided that that's where it's going. But all of the issues that we're talking about here are key components of, if the board does proceed, the kind of issues that need to be laid out. Obviously, the first one is definitional between an appraisal and an evaluation, but then would the standards mirror the interagency guidelines? Would there be a little more? You know, that's a question that, quite frankly, the board is not ready to answer yet because they haven't taken that step. But Wayne, is there anything you'd like to throw in there as well?
Yeah, you know, if I had a crystal ball, you know, then I might be able to give more specific answers. But I can only imagine that if there are eventually standards for evaluations developed, that there'll be a development standard and there'll be a reporting standard, and exactly what they say and what's contained therein is, you know, the $64,000 question, as I think you called it before, John.
Right. We have another question. Have we received any input from E&O insurance providers regarding an appraiser's liability in performing an evaluation? And I would say that from my knowledge, no. Wayne, have you heard any type of conversation along those lines?
I have not, but I'm actually interested in understanding the answer to that question, both in those states where we do have, you know, licensed or certified appraisers who are completing evaluations that are labeled as appraisals, and they also have the alternate label evaluations, and also in those states where legislation has passed that exempts a practicing appraiser who likely has E&O insurance associated with their appraisal business from calling that work an appraisal and from being under the jurisdiction of their state appraiser licensing board. So I don't know the answer. I'm curious about that answer.
Right. And again, if we talk back about, you know, what the ASB has said publicly and included in their summary of actions and all of the issues surrounding the last exposure process for the 2020-21 edition of continuing to examine that possibility of a single set of minimum reporting requirements, there may not be labels involved at all. And so those are things that it's all part of the bigger process here of examining this issue. There's another question asking if the ASB is considering changing the definition of an appraisal. And I would say if the ASB does proceed with looking at standards for evaluations, that probably would be a requisite part of it, wouldn't it, Wayne?
I would think so. There would have to be something if you're going to develop a definition of evaluation that somehow looks like a subset of appraisal, then clearly the definition of appraisal would have to account for that as well.
There's a question that says, if the ASB does develop standards for evaluations, would they be voluntary or mandatory for appraisers to follow under Title 11?
That's an interesting question. It depends is the answer, which I don't like to give it depends as an answer, but I can envision a situation where a state says, if you are a licensed or certified appraiser, you hold a credential in our state. When you issue something that says market value, you must comply with USPAP and you're subject to the jurisdiction of the state law. In this case, if there were evaluation standards, I can imagine that your responsibility would be to comply with the rules that are up front, competency and ethics and record keeping as they may evolve as a result of this issue, as well as those evaluation standards. For shorthand, let's call them standards 11 and 12, right? Development and reporting of evaluations. In a case where a state has an existing law that says, if you're a certified or licensed appraiser, you have to comply with USPAP when you render value, then they would just be saying, I am complying with the rules, I'm complying with the evaluation standards, I have completed an evaluation, thank you very much.
Yeah.
FIREA, would say, well, you don't have to hire bank, you don't necessarily have to hire an appraiser to do an evaluation, but the state rules and laws for certified and licensed appraisers would kick in certainly in states where there is no exemption.
Right, and as you mentioned, several states have already adopted requirements and allowing appraisers to perform evaluations without complying with USPAP. The interesting thing that most state laws say when you're a licensed or certified appraiser, as Wayne alluded to, is you have to comply with USPAP. It doesn't say you have to comply with standards 1 and 2. It doesn't say you have to comply with the specifics of a rule. So that is an issue that if the ASB does move forward, that is something that would require some discussion with the state appraiser, regulatory officials, and others as to exactly how that would be enforced. But that's a very, very good question. There's another question that says, if standards are adopted for evaluations, will non-licensed or certified individuals that perform the services be required to follow the standards and be governed by state law? I think the answer is it depends, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's again, a loaded question. USPAP itself does not determine when one must comply. Right? One has to comply when they're required by law, by agreement with the client, or when they say they're compliant. So again, this is an evaluation, so if a financial institution contacts an individual or company that is going to provide an evaluation to that financial institution, it would be up to that financial institution to determine whether they want non-licensed individuals to comply with USPAP, just as they could today with or without an evaluation standard rule. So, that would be up to individual institutions, but what it would do is enable appraisers who are certified and licensed to comply by complying with those portions of USPAP that are specific to evaluations.
Great. We have another question that says, as I scroll back to it, as gray as this issue and others are, they become even more complicated for appraisers who are salaried employees of financial institutions. and before I read the rest of it, I will say that, you know, again, this really ties into state law because some states do have carve-outs or exemptions for licensed or certified appraisers who work on staff at federally regulated financial institutions. But having said that, the question goes on to say, has the ASB given any thought to providing guidance specifically to appraisers who are employees of financial institutions?
Well, that's even further down the rabbit hole. So I can only say no. You know, at this point, the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines, you know, require or provide guidance to financial institutions as to how to operate an effective appraisal and evaluation or real estate collateral valuation program in general, right? Those, again, are their guidelines. There's some good information in there that, you know, when your bank examiners come, I'm sure that they're looking at that, even though it's considered a guideline, to see what you're doing that's similar to or different from that. And consequently, you know, if the folks who are on staff who are certified or licensed appraisers are, you know, handling appraisals, evaluations, or review of either of the above, at the end of the day, you know, I would think that the bank regulators are looking at how that complies with federal law and how that enables the institution to protect the safety and soundness of their real estate portfolio.
Great. Another question here, and I'll take first shot at this one, and if you want to jump in, feel free, Wayne. The question is, what steps, if any, is the Appraisal Foundation taking to bring states into better alignment with their regulatory statutes as they relate to the appraisal profession? It would seem that much of the confusion in the industry stems from various laws found from state to state. So, you know, as we all know, that states are responsible for enforcing USPAP for their state licensed and certified appraisers. And yes, there are 55 different jurisdictions out there, and they don't all see things the same way. We strongly encourage as much consistency as possible. I think the profession can sometimes suffer if one state issues a warning letter to somebody that has the exact same violations in another state and that results in a suspension or revocation. I think we lose a little credibility as a profession for that. To that end, we work with ARO, the Association of Appraisal Regulatory Officials, and we work with the states to try to make sure that when they have questions about compliance with USPAP and stuff, that we're able to answer them in a consistent manner. We also have, for the last several editions of USPAP, created a voluntary disciplinary sanction matrix that we update with every edition of USPAP. We're in the process of updating it right now for the one that becomes effective on January 1st. That kind of gives examples of sanctions, of disciplinary sanctions as a result of an example of USPAP violations. So, you know, somebody performs unethically, these are the kind of sanctions you might see, etc. I would say that's available on our website. The state appraiser regulatory officials, some use that, some don't. It is 100% voluntary, but the goal there is consistent as much as possible enforcement, or at least understanding of what the issues are to determine the enforcement. That is an issue that does come up from time to time. So I don't know, Wayne, if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, two other things, you know, and Jim Park, who's the staff executive with the appraisal subcommittee, you know, puts together a webinar or PowerPoint presentation that I've seen a number of times, and it talks about the sort of the three-legged stool of the appraiser regulatory system, you know, the foundation through its standards board in this case. Also, there's the quals board, but we put together these standards and quals. The states are responsible for licensing appraisers and if you will, disciplining them and, monitoring their performance, disciplining them when necessary. And then the appraisal subcommittee actually audits the state. So I think embedded in the question was, what is the foundation doing to make sure that states are complying with their own laws? Well, that's really the role of the appraisal subcommittee who goes through I want to say it's every 2 years or 24 months, whichever comes first, and audits the states to make sure that they are in fact complying with federal law, and they look at their own state statute to see what they're doing. So that's one aspect. The other piece, John, that goes along with this, and in addition to the disciplinary matrix, there's also a joint effort between Arrow and the Appraisal Foundation, and I believe the Appraisal Subcommittee as well, that we have investigator training courses so that investigators from the various states can come and learn about, discipline, how to read an appraisal, how to examine a work file, what USPAP says about all of that. And there are actually, I believe, 3 different course levels, that folks can go to in order to learn about that, so that hopefully there's not a lot of disparity between states where, in one case you get a $50 fine and a slap on the wrist, another place you get beheaded. So that's an effort that tries to cross jurisdictional boundaries and bring about some similarity as to how the rules are enforced.
And that's a great addition, Wayne. And you're exactly right. We've had over 1,000 administrations of the courses, and they are very well received. And while the goal is to have a common understanding and process of investigating complaints, ultimately the decision on what's done after that does fall to the state, and that's where we try to tie in the disciplinary matrix. The very last question is a short and simple one. And that was somebody asked how many people attended today. And I looked at one point early on and we had just under 600 people. So that's just an FYI for those of you who attended and are asking, somewhere around 590 to 600 people. With that, we will give you back the rest of your day. We sincerely thank you for participating and listening in and watching today. And please, as Wayne has indicated, share your comments on the concept paper, watch the public meeting via live stream. And again, if you didn't catch all of this presentation today, this webinar, it will be recorded and on our YouTube channel for later viewing. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much, Wayne.
John, again, always a pleasure to be with you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Outstanding. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you being here.